You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than why is the word phonetic not spelled the way it sounds, that question would have to be, Mark, what are your impressions of the Canon 28mm f2.8 LTM lens adapted to Leica M and the Nikon Z system? Well, today we are going to try and answer that question. Now, I've complained before about 28mm being the most boring focal length for a lens. Sorry, 28mm, but you are the boring uncle at the wedding. We've heard all your stories before, and you have nothing to add to the party as you shuffle your way through the Macarena and stare down the tops of bridesmaids. This isn't going to be a revisionist treatise of the merits of a 28, but the fact is, it's a common focal length, and it's a good tool to have in your optical repository, even if you only use it to replicate that phone field of view for your food photos. And it's a focal length that has been missing on my manual rangefinder system for some time. One of the main reasons for this is that they just didn't make many good wide-angle lenses for the Leica thread mount. Wide-angle lenses were difficult to make back in the day, with quite a few optical compromises, as we'll see in a moment. About the only reasonably priced 28mm lens you could buy was the Soviet Orion 15 for the Leica screw mount. That maxes out at only f5.6 aperture and still isn't cheap, but even at these inflated 21st century prices, it's still a fraction of the cost of a second-hand Leica Elmarit. Well, my children are too old and too aware of their rights to sell into indentured servitude, so I needed something that provided a bit more versatility than the Orion, but wouldn't require me to construct a complex mind palace of spurious logic to justify the cost. Don't get me wrong, my brain is both palatial and fallacial, and I'm capable of convincing myself that even the Acolyte has a place in the Star Wars universe.
The power of yes.
But I couldn't stomach the L word, so ended up settling on a Canon 28mm lens as a compromise to a genuine Leica when I was out shopping in Shinjuku for something completely different. And here it is. It's small and it's bright with an f2.8 aperture. It's also a reassuring slab of brass and glass with enough heft to make you know that you're holding something substantial. And hey, I'm not slumming it. This was the lens of choice for Gary Winogrand to document the ascendancy of post-war America through its slow decline and the despondency of the late 70s, before dying of cancer aged 56 in 1984, leaving behind an indelible catalogue of important work, as well as thousands of rolls of undeveloped film. Well, I'm already the same age as Winogrand, and while my own body of work is a wheezing husk of unfulfilled ambition, I do have the internet, so can leave my own indelible mark on the world with my legacy of thousands of unwatched videos. But you're here, and that's all that matters. So let's see what this lens can do. Using my typical modus operandi, landing in some obscure part of the world for a day of meetings and squeezing in an hour for a photo walk, this time in Shenzhen, and my weapon of choice is my oh-so-pretty Leica M2 with Kentmere 100 to show off how this 28mm Canon performs on film. f8 now. I go to 125th and go to f2.8. Cool tree, and that's pretty dark. 60th f2.8, not bad. I was in Happy Valley. Yes, that's actually a place name. Really, it could have been called Uncanny Valley because it did have that weird sense of a theme park that had everything except people. You could describe a lot of Chinese urban development along the same lines, but regardless, I do think that stark black and white was the best way to render the colors of this corner of Shenzhen overseas Chinese town. And yes, that's a real place name too. But enough about the wonder and weirdness of China. There's an hour-long video you can watch after this one where I dissect that predilection for the peculiar. Today we're talking about this particular optic, the Canon 28mm f2.8 LTM. And it really is an object of beauty. It's small, first of all, with just enough room for your fingers to adjust the focus, with that infinity lock guaranteeing to annoy you when you need to adjust focus on the fly. Actually, it's just like my Nikon 5cm in that regard, and those who complain about focus lock probably just haven't given themselves time to get used to it. The Canon 28 has also gone the same route of having the same aperture ring at the front of the lens. Again, that works fine here. It's a problem on one of my lenses where if I do try to adjust the aperture, it throws off the focus, but on this one, the aperture clips are looser than the focus ring, so you don't have to refocus if you're going to adjust exposure. Other than that, it's just an innocuous little thing, with 6 elements in 4 groups that essentially mirror each other. Don't kid yourself, you're getting anything here with the sophistication of a modern design and the clinical sharpness of a contemporary lens. This one is classic in all of those ways that embrace imperfections and afford you a unique character for your photos. Well, that's been the great promise of vintage lenses, and I don't think this one disappoints. We'll dissect the image quality in a moment, but let's acknowledge that this is a lens that's made for film. It was introduced in 1957 and nearly as old as rock and roll, and if not quite as old as the Leica they sent off to space in Sputnik 2, at least this Leica lens is still here to celebrate 2025. So its pedigree is as pure as a Siberian husky and a great match for black and white, since colour didn't even exist back then as far as I know. I have had this lens for a while now, but I've delayed its debut here until I thought you'd grown up enough to appreciate it with a certain level of maturity, but also because my first experiences with it hadn't really given me the confidence to fully understand this lens. Firstly, I bought it primarily for my Canon P, and my first outing with the 28mm on it revealed a bit of a quirk with that camera, where the shutter seemed to drag at faster speeds. Taking it to the rangefinder doctor revealed an issue with the stitching on the shutter curtain coming loose, which is a problem both too big and too small and fiddly for these sausage fingers. So if anyone is looking for a fixer-upper Canon P rangefinder, let me know. But it's what prompted the purchase of this Leica M2, and I've slowly been getting used to both this and the 28mm because this lens is quirky too. The good thing is that while the M2 doesn't have 28mm frame lines, if you use the whole viewfinder, it pretty much corresponds to 28mm field of view. That's why you probably saw me take my glasses off on a few of the shots, so I could smush my face up against the camera to see the full frame. Of course, that's not going to be an issue if you are planning to use it on a digital camera. In 2025, you get all of the benefits of the focus assist tools on your full frame mirrorless, and usually a higher resolution to test the lens and reveal any of the flaws that may be masked by the chunky grain and imperfections of film. So let's really put this thing through its paces, chucking it on my Nikon Z6 with a dumb adapter and an even dumber photographer behind the camera for a waltz through Vienna, Austria, from the museum district to Naschmarkt, where there are more old things for sale to make this lens feel at home. Well, this flea bag of a photographer has now experienced the flea markets of Vienna, and there was nothing to compare with this lens on the trestle tables of old Praktikas and Kodak Instamatics. Really, this is a unique and special thing. Don't get me wrong though, it's not perfect. In fact, far from it. Objectively, you could argue that this lens kind of sucks. I mean, let's just tick off the negatives first. Flaring, yes it does. Despite the glass being quite deeply recessed into the lens barrel, this thing greets the sun like it's part of a 1970s roller disco light show, with spots, rings, big hexagonal blobs, and an overall veiling flare and loss of contrast across the whole frame, if you do it right. Or wrong. You could probably use it to creative effect, but the fact that I don't have any real examples here is an indication of how I tend to keep the sun to the side or behind me for this type of photography anyway. It's probably more obvious in the video because I shot that whole sequence on the 28mm too. Honestly, flaring is the smallest issue with this lens. The biggest one, without a doubt, is vignetting, because at f2.8 this darkens the corner of your image like you're barreling through a Brenner Pass tunnel, looking through a toilet roll with glaucoma. Now, I love a tasteful vignette, but this is extreme, and it never really seems to disappear throughout the aperture range. Oh, and at f2.8, it's soft too. Not Holger soft maybe, at least not in the center, but as you move from the middle of the image, it becomes decidedly smeary. Fortunately, you won't notice because the corners are too dark to see anything anyway. But look, you get the idea. This is not a perfect lens, but sometimes you get something that isn't just good despite its imperfections, but actually because of them. And I think that that's true of this one. There's a painterly quality to the rendering that makes you just forgive its flaws. Let's look at this photo, firstly at f2.8 and then stop down to f16. And you know what? I like both of them. At the wide aperture, there's a dreamy feel to the image that enhances rather than diminishes the look. Being a bit off to the side, the bark of the tree is still smudgy despite being a point of focus, but it still has enough separation between it and the background to create some three-dimensionality to it. Stop it down and the image just bursts with detail and color. It's not clinical with critical edge sharpness, but the texture of the bark has a beautiful micro contrast, and there's a sense, even in a fairly vernacular picture like this one, that whenever you look across the frame, that there are colorful little details just drawing you in. So it wasn't difficult to pick 6 favorites from Shenzhen and Vienna. Different locations, different media, and different vibes, with the desultory Happy Valley being the largo contrapunto to the florid Viennese opera of the busy street market. Of course, with digital, I have far more to choose from, but I'm going to still find 3 black and white crotchets to compete with the colourful digital score of the Austrian flea market. Honestly, there was enough human interest among the shoppers and vendors of Naschmarkt to probably make a photo book, which is something I keep threatening to do on this channel. But hey, there's a definite skill to self-editing, and reflexivity is an atrophied muscle that I rarely flex. So let's try and be tough on myself and just pick these 3 as the prima donnas of the colourful cast. So that's the Canon 28mm f2.8 for the Leica thread mount. It has now had its debut on this channel, and I'm sure it'll be the diva of my diversions from more interesting focal lengths when I feel the need to go wide and when I want that breadth served in a small package with an extra dollop of light flares and fall off. What do you think? Tell me in the comments about whether you're familiar with this lens or you have any other recommendations for lenses that have the same amount of character. And while you're at it, subscribe and hit that notification bell because there's some more visual Wiener schnitzels on the menu, and I'm going to go even wider. To be honest, I was surprised at how well it fared, even on my Nikon Z6, where I think the pixel pitch of the sensor did have a tendency to exaggerate the color shifts and fall-offs at the edge of the frame too. In future, I'll probably feel the need to add a bit of noise to the image to give it a bit of grain, a bit of texture to the overall softness, but really in the center, it's sharp enough. And on film, this sings like the libretto to Don Giovanni, a lewd and licentious lens at f2.8 that nevertheless settles down to comfortable servitude as you stop it down, giving a more orderly, refined, and dare I say classical rendering that is the perfect marriage of Figaro to my Leica M2. Later.